Good morning, Criminology. So you guys already have the lecture on chapter 11. This is going to be the lecture on chapter 8. Chapter 8 is on critical and feminist theories. So this week, you guys only have reading to do, as well as I have posted up the instructions for the paper that you guys have coming up that is due at the end of the course, well, near the end of the course. So it's due the second to last week at the end. Again, it's only 3 pages. It's based on a theory of your choice. You grab the theory from, of course, this textbook, and then relate the theory to a crime or criminal event that has happened within the last 6 months. It's easy. Again, this is not an English class, it is a criminology class, so I will not be going too hard on the grammar and all of that. Sound good? Do your best, and let's get to chapter 8. Okay, so let me share my screen with you guys, and let's get this started. Okay, so we are moving on into chapter 8, critical and feminist theories. Okay, as usual, at the beginning of every single chapter that we have had up until this point, there are learning objectives. These learning objectives, again, you find them at the beginning of the chapter. You can also find them in our Blackboard course website. I am going to go over them for this particular lecture. There are a few, but they are short. So I'm going to go over them before we get into the first section of our chapter, the conflict perspective of society. So some of the things, some of the key points and takeaways that we should walk away from this chapter knowing is how to evaluate the underlying assumptions of the conflict perspective. We should be able to compare the way modern Marxists perceive crime and criminals versus the way Karl Marx himself did. You should be able to discuss the many ways that Marxists and the conflict theorists view concepts such as crime, class, and conflict. You should be able to define the tenets of peacemaking, convict, and green criminology. You should be able to evaluate the applicability of critical criminology and feminist theories. You should be able to explain why females differ from males so much in their risk for criminal behavior. And lastly, you should be able to assess the policy recommendations of critical and feminist theories. So let's get to it. Our first section of chapter 8 goes into the conflict perspective of society. Okay. So critical criminology is an umbrella term for a variety of theories united only by the assumption that conflict and power relations between various classes of people best characterizes the nature of society. Adherents of diverse theories quarrel among themselves, and they coin new names for their theories such as conflict, radical, critical, new criminology, radical human rights criminology, Marxist, neo-Marxist, and left realist. Okay. Plutarch, and I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but Plutarch wrote of the conflicts generated by disparity in wealth in Athens in 594 BC. US President John Adams wrote that American society during the late 18th century was divided into a small group of rich men and a great mass of poor engaged in constant class struggle. So a struggle between those who have those small amount of rich men and the masses, the majority of the population that is poor and engaged in this constant class struggle. Okay. Let's go into Karl Marx and the revolution. Karl Marx, he's known as the father of critical criminology, which most of you know if you've taken a Social 101 class with me. But the core of Marxism is the concept of class struggle. Freedom and slave patricians and plebeians, lords and serfs, guild masters and journeymen, in a word, oppressor and the oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another. The oppressor during Marx's time were the owners of the means of production. These individuals were known as the bourgeoisie, and the oppressed were the workers, the proletariat. The bourgeoisie strived to keep the cost of the labor at minimum, enjoying the upper hand because capitalist societies have large armies of unemployed workers anxious to secure work at any price, thus driving down the cost of labor. Okay. For Marx and Engels, crime was simply the product of people rebelling against unjust and alienating social conditions. This became known as the primitive rebellion hypothesis. Okay. Alienation, another concept central to critical criminology, describes the distancing of individuals from something. Most individuals in capitalist societies were alienated from work, which led to alienation from themselves and from others. Marx thought wage labor dehumanized humans by taking from them their creative advantage over other animals, robbing them of the species being, in effect, their human nature, and reducing them to the level of animals. Okay. When individuals become alienated from themselves, they become alienated from others and from their society in general, treating others as mere objects to exploit and victimize as they themselves are supposedly by the capitalist system. Okay. And then Lumpenproletariat, which is a term that is fairly, I don't remember from Das Kapital from Karl Marx, but it's the lowest criminal class in Marxist theory. Okay, I usually just use the term proletariat, but again, this is the lowest criminal class when we're looking at Marxist theory. Willem Bonger, this is the first Marxist criminologist. For Bonger, the roots of crime lay in the exploitive and the alienating conditions of capitalism, although some individuals are at greater risk for crime than others. Okay. Bonger believed that capitalism generates egoism and altruism, because it relies on competition for scarce, valuable resources, setting persons against persons and groups against groups, leaving the losers to their miserable fates. All individuals in capitalist societies are infected by egoism, and thus all are prone to crime. The poor out of economic necessity, the rich and the middle class from pure greed. Poverty was a major cause of crime for Bonger, particularly its effects on family structure, specifically that of the broken home, and poor parental supervision of children. Because of his emphasis on family structure and what he saw as the moral deficits of the poor, Bonger has been criticized by other Marxists, but he firmly believed that only by transforming society from capitalism to socialism would it be possible to regain the altruistic sentiments and reduce crime. Okay. Moving on into modern Marxist criminology. During the 1980s, Marxists, calling themselves left realists, began to acknowledge predatory street crime as a real source of concern among the working class, whose members are the primary victims of it. Left realists understood that they have to translate their concern for the poor into practical, realistic social policies. This theoretical shift signals a move away from the former singular emphasis on the political economy to embrace the interrelatedness of the offender, the victim, the community, and the state in causes of crime. Okay. It also signals a return to a more orthodox Marxist view of criminals as people whose activities are against the interests of the working and ruling class. Although unashamedly socialist in orientation, left realists have been criticized by more traditional Marxists who see their advocacy of solutions to street crime problems within the context of capitalism as a sellout. Okay. Pardon, I went on too far. Okay. Now we're going on into conflict theory. So this is in reference to Max Weber and power and conflict. Okay. In common with Marx, Max Weber, between the years of 1864 and 1920, saw societal relationships as best characterized by conflict. Weber saw cultural's economic system molded by its ideas that conflict arising from multiple sources, with economic conflict often subordinate to other conflicts, contending that capitalism will always exist. Marx envisioned the end of conflict with the destruction of capitalism, while Weber contended that capitalism will always exist regardless of the social, economic, and political nature of society, and that it was functional because of its role in bringing disputes into the open for public debate. Okay. Weber viewed the various class divisions in society as normal, inevitable, and acceptable. He focused on three types of social groups that form and dissolve as their interests change: class, party, and status. Okay. For Weber, the law is a resource by which the powerful are able to impose their will on others by criminalizing acts contrary to their class interests. Okay, so law is a resource of the powerful. Okay. George Vold, and we're moving into a slight discussion about him. George Vold produced a version of conflict theory that moves conflict away from an emphasis on value and normative conflicts to include conflicts of interest, those between youth gangs and adult authorities being of particular concern. Vold saw social life as a continual struggle to maintain or improve the interests of one's own groups: workers against management, race against race, ecologists against land developers, and the young against the adult authority, with new interest groups continually forming and disbanding as conflicts arise and are resolved. Gangs are an example of a minority power group or groups whose interests are sufficiently on the margins of mainstream society such that just about their activities, just anything that they do are criminalized. Like Weber, Vold viewed conflict as normal, socially desirable, and a way of ensuring social change, and in the long run, a way of ensuring social stability. Okay. So before we go on into section 4, this is the figure from our chapter 8. You can actually find this figure on page, give me a second. It wasn't in the text. On page 145, this is a table that compares Marxist and conflict theory on major concepts. Okay, so please pause here. You have your concept in the left column, at least on my left column, the Marxist view of that concept, and then the conflict that Marxist view sees ensuing. Okay, so pause here for a second. And one more time before you move on, again, this is table 8.1. Table 8.1 is going to summarize for you the differences between Marxist and conflict theories, specifically on certain types of key concepts, okay? So let's move on to other critical criminologies, okay? So the first one, when we're talking about different types and other types of critical criminologies, peacemaking criminology, okay? Peacemaking criminology is a fairly recent addition to the growing number of theories in criminology and has drawn a number of former Marxists into its fold. It is situated squarely in the postmodernist tradition, a tradition that rejects the notion that the scientific view is better than any other view and disparages the claim that any method of understanding can be objective. Peacemaking criminologists reject the modernist view aimed at understanding, explaining, predicting, and controlling crime, and appeal for a diversity of views in which none is disparaged and all are legitimized. Peacemaking criminologists, how do I pronounce it, or how do I say it? Avere. Okay, that's the term that's coming to my head. I'm trying to think of another one. But peacemaking criminologists avere that an overemphasis on punishing criminals escalates violence. Richard Quinley has called the American criminal justice system the moral equivalent of war. Okay, in its peacemaking endeavors, it relies heavily on appreciative relativism, a position that holds all points of views, including those of criminals, as relative and worthy of appreciation. In place of imprisoning offenders, peacemaking criminologists advocate restorative justice, which is basically a system of meditation, not meditation, but mediation and conflict resolution. Peacemaking criminology, its basic philosophy is similar to the 1960s hippie adage, make love, not war, without the sexual overtones. It shudders at the current war on crime metaphor and wants to substitute peace over crime. Lastly, restorative justice has been applauded because it humanizes justice by bringing victim and offender together, specifically to try to correct the wrong done, usually in the form of written apologies and payment of restitution. Another type of critical criminology is convict criminology, okay? Convict criminology is not a theory in the formal sense of specifically containing a series of propositions from which hypotheses can be deduced and empirically tested. It is best described as an insider perspective on incarceration that has an agenda. The primary method of study of convict criminologists is ethnography, which is a method used by anthropologists to study alien cultures. So cultures that we're not used to, in other words. So I'm not literally talking about something foreign. Another type of other critical criminology is green criminology. Green criminology is an extension of radical criminology that concerns itself with the study of crimes and other harms against the environment. True to its roots in Marxism and radical feminism, both capitalism and patriarchy are seen as the roots of green crime. Okay. So we just went over peacemaking criminology, convict criminology, and green criminology. Chapter 8 then goes on into an evaluation of these critical theories, okay? Marxists tend to ignore empirical studies, preferring historical, descriptive, and illustrative research. They also seem to assume that the conditions prevailing during Marxist time still exist today in advanced capitalist societies. Left realism realizes this specifically and is more the reform-minded practical wing of Marxism than a theory of crime that has anything special to offer criminology. Conflict theory is challenging and refreshing because its efforts to identify power relationships in society have applications that go beyond criminology. Despite their differences, both Marxist and conflict criminologists draw a fairly straightforward line between capitalism and conflict, respectively, and criminal behavior. According to Ronald Ackers in 1997, peacemaking criminologists take the extreme position that denies crime as such really exists, implying that there is no such thing as crime as an objective behavioral reality to be explained. Okay. Frank Cullen notes that convict criminology avoids examining crime causation. However, there is value in its ethnographic data on the prison experience itself from the convict's point of view. It is difficult to criticize green criminology with its emphasis on protecting the ecosystem, which is overly simplistic and ignores the many nuances of environmental protection that scholars in other areas point out. Okay. Now getting into feminist criminology, okay? So let's go over concepts and concerns of feminist criminology. The core concept of feminist theory or feminist theorizing is patriarchy, which literally means rule of the father and is used to describe any social system that is male dominated at all levels and is supported by the belief in male superiority. Feminist criminologists wrestle with two major concerns, the first being, do traditional male-centered theories of crime apply to women? This is known as the generalizability problem. The history of criminology has focused primarily on the delinquency of young males and has virtually ignored females. The generalizability problem has been defined as the quest to find theories that account equally for male and female offending. Okay. Many feminist criminologists have concluded that male-centered theories have limited applicability to females because they focused on male frustration in their efforts to obtain success goals and ignore female relationships to goals. Others wonder why a special feminist theory is needed, since most offenders tend to be found in the same places as their male counterparts. That is, among single-parent families located in poor, socially disorganized neighborhoods. Individual level correlates of male offending, such as low self-control, low IQ, attention deficit with hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, are also correlated with female offending. And again, this is something that Gluck points out in 1935. The gender ratio problem is this specifically: what explains the universal fact that women are far less likely than men to involve themselves in criminal activity? Women's liberation and crime, okay? Frida Adler in 1975, specifically with her masculinization hypothesis, states that the masculinization hypothesis was that the adoption of male roles would result in female attitudes and behavior becoming masculinized, and eventually crime rates matching those of males. Rita Simone in 1975's emancipation hypothesis claimed that increased participation in the workplace afforded women greater opportunities to commit job-related crimes. An interpretation linking women's liberation to female crime is the economic marginalization hypothesis, according to which both the increasing crime and poverty rates are indirectly related to the women's liberation movement. It argues that both Adler and Simone neglect to pay sufficient attention to patriarchy and the extent to which males control female labor and sexuality. And specifically, the women's liberation movement has generated efforts by women to free themselves from the power of men. But by doing so, women had freed men from their traditional roles as providers. Okay. Going into power control theory. Power control theory views gender differences and antisocial behavior as a function of power differentials in the family, and states that these arise from the positions these spouses occupy in the workforce. Patriarchal families are viewed as granting greater freedom to boys to prepare them for traditional male roles, while daughters are socialized to be feminine, conforming, and domesticated. The egalitarian family develops in the absence of large differences between the work roles of parents and where the responsibility for child rearing is shared. Power relations in such families are said to be balanced, and parents socialize males and female children similarly. According to Siegel in 1992, it is not only middle-class girls who will increase their offending. Power control theory then implies that middle-class youth of both sexes will have higher crime rates than their lower-class peers. Going on into structured action theory and doing gender, okay? James, I cannot pronounce his last name and I will not try to, but James's structured action theory is the concept of hegemonic masculinity, defined through work in the paid labor market, the subordination of women, heterosexism, and the driven, uncontrollable sexuality of the male. Hegemonic masculinity is the cultural ideal of masculinity that men are expected to live up to, which, although is about living up to masculine ideas and distancing the masculine self from femininity, it's also a way to maintain patriarchy. Gender is something males and females demonstrate and accomplish rather than something they automatically are by virtue of biological sense. So in other words, we do gender. We learn how to be men. We learn how to be women, etc. At least what society states how, like, feeds to us how we should be, okay? Doing gender is an ongoing process by which males express masculinity to be socially validated. In low-income cultures, this often involves violent confrontations over status issues, because taking matters into one's own hands is seen as the only way to obtain masculine status, specifically on the street, okay? James also theorizes about doing femininity, okay? Before I go into the explanations of evolutionary, let's just go back, because, yeah, let's go back. Okay, James also theorizes about doing femininity among gang girls and women engaging in bad girl femininity, showing that since gender is fluid and context specific, there is no incompatibility between acting bad and femininity. Both Hagen and James's theories place sole reliance on socialization and gender roles to explain differences in male and female offending. Now let's go on into explanations from evolutionary biology to neurobiology, okay? The basic argument is that because the size of the gender gap varies across time and space, and yet still remains constantly wide at all times and in all places, biological factors must play a major part. Feminists who include biological thinking in their theories assert that sex differences in dominance and aggression are seen in all human cultures from the earliest days of life and are observed in all primate and most mammal species. Okay. Neuroscientists have long known that chemistry organizes the brain in male or female directions while we are still in our mother's wombs, in such a way that males become more vulnerable to various traits associated with antisocial behavior. According to many theorists, the major explanation for gender differences in crime is differences in fear and empathy, females on the higher end of both. So these are traits underlined by testosterone and oxytocin. Oxytocin, which is the cuddler chemical. Okay. And Campbell's staying alive hypotheses. So Campbell in 1999 describes herself as a liberal evolutionary feminist who has attempted to account for the gender ratio problem using the logic of evolutionary theory in her staying alive hypothesis. She notes that offspring survival is more critical to female reproductive success. So the passing of one's genes to subsequent generation is the ultimate goal of all forms of life than to male reproductive success. Campbell argues that because offspring survival is so enormously important to females' reproductive success, females have evolved the propensity to avoid engaging in behaviors that pose survival risks. Now, an evaluation of feminist theories. Although Hagen and James's theories offer some interesting insights regarding family dynamics and how gender is perceived in different social contexts, they may not have moved the discipline actually forward. James's theory seems to be a rehash of the old subcultural theories in which doing gender is substituted for male status striving stressed by subcultures such as Albert Cohen, specifically during the 1950s. If forced to boil down the reasons for the universal sex difference in criminal behavior to their bare minimum, differences in empathy and fear would be the strongest candidates. Empathy is other-oriented and prevents one from committing committing acts injurious to others because one has the emotional and cognitive investment in the well-being of others. Fear is self-oriented and prevents one from committing acts injurious to others out of fear of the consequences to one's self. Many other pro-social tendencies flow from these two basic foundations, such as a strong conscience, altruism, self-control, and agreeableness. Campbell's staying alive / high fear hypothesis is about why females commit so little crime, not why females commit it, but it does address the gender ratio problem. Campbell's hypothesis must be augmented with cultural factors because we sometimes see females committing more serious crimes than males. The last section goes into policy and prevention of chapter 8. Okay, so first, let's do the implications of critical theories. The policy implication of Marxist theories are straightforward. Substitute socialism for capitalism and crime will be reduced. Most Marxists today realize that this is unrealistic, a fact underlined for them by the collapse of socialist states across specifically Eastern Europe. Rather than throw out the entire ideological agenda, left realists now temper their views while still maintaining their critical stance towards the system. Since conflict theorists view conflict and the existence of social classes as normal, it is difficult to recommend policies specifically derived from conflict theory. Some implications of feminist theories. Feminist criminologists have impacted the criminal justice system more strongly than criminology, and their efforts to fight gender stereotypes have moved women into previously all-male occupations. Feminists also fought for other reforms, such as removing the spousal exception to rape and rape shield laws, protecting a rape victim's sexual history from examination in a rape trial. Okay. Feminist criminology has been quite successful in pushing for a more just, less patriarchal, and more sensitive criminal justice system. Lastly, the critical perspective is a useful tool for critiquing the criminal law and its implication, and scrutinizing the criminal justice system through such lens helps us identify injustice within it. Okay, so those are your 2 lectures for this week. Again, is this recording? Yeah, okay. Those are your 2 lectures for this week. Easy week, read, but do catch up on any assignments that you might be missing, and get started on those theory papers. See you later.